Pioneer Girl, Chapter 7. The 25th of September, the fall rains began. The 1st of October. It cleared for a few days, and we were thinking of going back to town for the winter when it began again to rain. It was dreary and drizzly all day, the 8th and the 9th. All work in town was stopped, and Pa had began hunting both days, bringing in some ducks, but no geese. He said the ducks and geese were not stopping to feed in the sloughs, but were flying high and fast going south, and he didn't like the looks of the weather. The dull gray days were disheartening, and I didn't feel like picking and dressing the ducks, but did my work as cheerfully as I could, not wishing to add to the gloom. It was raining harder when I went to sleep, and there was drip drip of rain on the bed covers over my shoulders where it came through a hole the wind had torn in the tar paper covering the roof. We never paid any attention to the slight discomfort, and so I slept soundly until some time in the night. I suppose the stopping of the noise of the drip waked me, for I found it was no longer raining, was colder, and snuggling closer under the covers, I slept again. When next I waked, Pa was building a fire and singing, "Oh, I am a big sunflower that nods and bends in the breezes, and my heart is as light as the wind that blows and comes and goes as it pleases." I glanced at the window, but it seemed to be covered with the whiteness I could not see through. When the fire was going good, Ma got up, but when I started, she told me to lie still. We were all to lie still under the covers, for there was no use for our all being cold, and there was an awful blizzard outside. Pa bundled up warmly and struggled through the storm to the barn, going by the wagon, and nearly touched the house and a big haystack just beyond that nearly touched the barn. When he came back, Ma gave us some warm breakfast, and I insisted on getting up. But Mary, Carrie, and Grace stayed in the bed all day to keep warm, while Pa, Ma, and I hovered over the stove, for it was frightfully cold, and the wind howled and shrieked with the sound of nothing else under heaven but a blizzard wind. Trying to look out the window or door, we could not see an inch until the storm, which lasted all day and night, and the next day, and into the night. Sometime that night the wind moderated a little, and on the morning of the third day we could see a short distance. For a while the snow was still blowing, and it was rolling along closer to the ground instead of filling all the air. We could see over it. Just beyond the dooryard were some cattle standing motionless with their heads hanging. Poor things, we thought they are tired. They are tired out. Later, when they had moved, we wondered why they didn't go to the haystacks, and because they looked strange standing still so long with their heads hanging, Pa went out to see what was the matter with them. He found that their breath and the snow blown into their eyelashes and the hair around their eyes had formed ice over their eyes until they could not see at all. They were tired out by their struggle with the storm, drifting before it for no one knew how many miles. There were 25 of them, and Pa went up to one after the other and tore the ice from their eyes. As soon as they could see, they bawled and ran from him a few steps, then stopped and stood still again. They were so tired. He came in and left them standing there, looking around, and at the desolate land with the snow blowing low across it. I suppose they were glad they could see it. After a while, they drifted down to the shelter of Haystack, where they stayed resting and eating until the next morning sometime, and then went away when they weren't noticing him. Pa went away, and we weren't noticing them. Pa went away, and several birds that had fallen exhausted in the shelter of one of them stacks of hay. Some of them were strange to us. We never saw any like them before, nor afterward. We kept them where they would not freeze until they were rested and the storm was entirely over, then turned them loose. The storm was always called the October blizzard. Hundreds of cattle perished in it, and some people were frozen to death. There was a nice spell of weather after it, but an old Indian passing through town warned the people that terrible winter was coming. He said the seventh winter was always harder than those before, then the winters would be mild again until another seven, which would be harder than the first. Mild winters would follow again until the third seven, which would be much worse than either of the others. He said it always been so, then that the winter coming was the third seven, and there would be heap big snow, and the woods would blow and blow. During the good weather, we moved into town for the winter. Pa was one of the county commissioners and also a justice of the peace. He had his office in the front room, while we lived in the one room, in the Liento room at the back, which with the bedrooms upstairs, everyone staying for the winter was living the same way in a small rooms back of their places of business upstairs over them, or in the few shanty houses on the back streets. George Masters, the eldest son of Uncle Sam Masters of the Walnut Grove, going through Desmond, begged Ma to let his wife Maggie stay with us to be nearer him. Maggie came the next week, a large, cheerful Scotch girl. We liked her, but we did not care for George, who was much like his father. A widow named Garland, with two grown daughters, Florence and Vinay, and a son about my age named Edward, but called Cap, had built a boarding house on the street back of us. Florence was hired to teach the school, which began the 1st of November, and Carrie and I started to school again. There were 15 pupils, all strangers, to catch each other, but beginning to feel acquainted when one still sunny day, as we were sitting quietly studying, the schoolhouse cracked and shook from a blow of wind that struck the northwest corner like a mighty sledge. The sun was blotted out, and we could see from the windows was a white blur, for all outside was whirling chaos of snow. Miss Garland looked frightened and said we could all go home, for us to put our wraps on quickly and fasten them good, that we must all stay close together and go with her. Just as we were ready to start, a man named Holmes came from town to help us get safely through the storm, for the schoolhouse was 3 blocks west of the business street, and there were no homes nor anything but bare prairie between. We started all close together, following Mr. Holmes and Miss Garland, but after a few minutes, Cap Garland left the others and went farther to the south. We shouted at him, but he disappeared in the storm running. We were blinded by the snow, buffeted by the wind until we could hardly keep our feet, and awfully cold. It seemed to me that we had already gone too far, and still there was no sign of buildings, when suddenly we ran against the back of a building that stood at the very end of the street, the last building in town on the north. We didn't see it until we bumped against it, and if we had gone just a few feet further north, we should have missed it and been out on the open prairie, lost in the blizzard. Cap Garland went straight, told the men downtown that we had gone wrong, and a crowd was just starting after us when we came walking up the street beside the buildings. For 3 days the blizzard raged, and no one thought of doing anything but staying safely home. Then the sun shone on the snow, packed in hard drifts by the wind. The wind was still, and people moved about again. The snow had filled the cuts on the railroad, and it was several days before the snowplows and men with shovels could clear the tracks so trains could run again. Maggie Masters' baby was born in her room upstairs, with only Ma and Mrs. Garland to help her. There was no doctor to be had. George came back from the west on the first train going east. His job was finished until spring and winter was getting in on the Ernst. Storms followed storms so quickly that the railroad track could not be kept open. The company kept men shoveling snow and snow plows working all they could, but the snow plows stuck in the snow, and the snow blew back faster than the men could shovel it out. On the 20th of November, a train went up the line, made the trip back. The next train through was a passenger and the mail train on January 4th. It went west to Huron, but could not get back and stayed there the rest of the winter. The superintendent of the division was much displeased at the failure of his men to get the trains through and came out to the deep cut west of Tracy to superintend the work himself. They were using two snowplows hitched together, but the snow was packed so hard that they could drive them only a few feet when they stuck fast and had to be shoveled out. The superintendent ordered them to put 3 plows on and dive them through. Then the engineer refused to drive the engine in front, saying they would all be killed. The superintendent replied that he wouldn't ask a man to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and with an oath he'd drive the engine himself. They put the other plow on, backed the train for a mile, then came as fast as they could and stuck in the snow in the cut with all the power of the engines, their weight and speed, and stopped. The front engine and its plow were completely buried, even the smokestack covered. By a miracle, the engineers were not hurt and crawled and were shoveled out. The impact, the heat, and the steam from the engine in the front melted the snow close around, and it froze again in solid ice. When the men had shoveled the snow away so they could get to it, they had to use picks to cut the ice from the wheels and gearing. It took 2 days with all the men that could work around them to get the engines loose. By the time another blizzard was raging and the superintendent ordered all work on the track stopped with the snow 100 feet deep on the track. Stopped with the snow 100 feet deep on the track, and the Tracy cut, and 25 feet deep on the track. The cut just went of Desmet. All the men in Desmet had worked at the shoveling. Most of them were glad of the $2 a day pay, but even those who didn't need the money worked because they wanted the trains to run. The last shoveling they did took 3 men to get 1 shovel full of snow to the top of the bank. One stood at the bottom and threw it as far as he could. The man above him threw it from his shovel as high as he could. The third man could throw it to the top of the bank. Then in the night more snow fell. The wind blew in the morning. The cut was again full, tight packed with the snow to the top of the snowbanks on each side, which were as high as the snow fences, which were supposed to hold snow back from the cut. At last the wind could blow the snow across the tops of the snow fences, across the snow on top of the track, and away from the other side, in its age-old sweep across the prairie. The man-made obstacle overcome and hidden. It did its best to blot out the town, but that it couldn't quite manage. Here, in his ages-long war with the elements, man won, though it was hard, long battle. During the night, the one street in town might be filled with snow packed so hard teams were driven over it, and so high a man sitting on a low sled could look on a level onto the second-story windows of the hotel and across the roofs of the other buildings. The next night, another blizzard would come, and the wind striking a little different angle would cut the snow away and sweep the street clean, so the length of it would be bare ground in the morning. We would lie in our beds those nights, listening to the wind howl and shriek while the house rocked with force of it, and the snow sifted in around the windows and through the nail holes where nails had been withdrawn from the houses were only shells at best. Once during the winter our little stable was entirely covered with snow, and Pa had to dig a tunnel through it from the back door to the stable door to get in and care for the stock. It had the great advantage of being a shelter for Pa, going and coming, and he was very sorry when one night the wind swept it all away and he had to meet the full force of the storm again. There were about 100 people in Desmet, and the town and country were so newly settled that no crops had been raised except a few sod potatoes. The two grocery stores were small and started with only a little capital. Not having much money to buy with and expecting to be able to replace the stock as it was sold, the storekeepers had only a small supply on hand, and when the train stopped running, it was too late to get more. It was the same with the coal sold at the lumber yard. Now, with no way of getting more supplies of both food and fuel, were running short. The storms were so terrible and so frequent that teaming from the Brookings could not be done, and supplies were short even there, for no train could run west of Tracy. The country was all anew. We were wondering how we would get through the winter, and we were so relieved when January 4th we heard the train whistle. Everyone ran to the depot, but it was only a train carrying passengers and mail. We thought surely there must be another train coming behind with food and fuel, but none came, and that night there was the worst storm yet. The track was buried again. Orders came over the telegraph wires to lay off all work, and we knew we could expect no help from the outside. We must depend on ourselves. Anyway, we had from the last train a letter from friends in Chicago dated in November saying they had sent us a Christmas barrel. They had hoped we would enjoy the Christmas turkey and the warm clothing it contained. We knew the old story of the colored man who, when asked which he preferred, a wreck on land or the water or on the water, replied he'd wreck on land because in a railroad smash up, dar ye is but in a steamboat bust up, where is ye? And we knew that in this wreck of the railroad there we were. There was no meat to be had, no butter, the potatoes were nearly gone. The only fruit there had been in town was the dried fruit, and that was long since gone from the stores. We had a little yet and a little bit of sugar. Coffee was gone, and tea. Pa had a little wheat he had bought for the seed, and the next spring, and Ma ground it, and made us a hot drink. What with the terrible cold and just dry hay to eat, our cows were nearly dry. Pa got about a quart at milking, and the most of that went to Grace and Maggie on account of the baby. Our sugar was gone, and the last sack at the store had sold for 50 cents a pound. Then the flour was all gone, and the last sack of that sold for $1 a pound. There was no more coal nor kerosene. For there For light, Ma put a bit of rag around a button, tied the button in with a thread, and leaving the loose end of the rag standing up about 2 inches, set the button in the saucer of axle grease that Pa had for greasing his wagon. When the end of the rag was lighted, the heat of its burning drew the grease into the rag and made a sort of candle that gave some light after a fashion. There was not much grease, and we did not use the light long at night, but went to bed early, saving both light and fire. When the coal was gone, we twisted the long, coarse sloth hay into sticks and burned that. It was quite a trick to take a handful of hay at the end of each hand, twist it into a kinked on itself in the middle, then twisting the two sides upon each other until the ends were reached, make a sort of knot, and tuck the ends in to hold tight. If well done, it made a hard twist from 18 inches to a foot long, about as large around as a stick of split cook wood. We called them sticks of hay, and they could be handled like sticks of wood. They made a surprisingly good fuel, a quick hot fire, but burned so quickly that must be twisting hay all the time to keep the fire going. Pa filled the storm shed over the back door with the loose hay, and he and Ma and I took turns twisting it. Carrie was too little, and though she wanted to help, was not allowed to do much. Mary had never been strong, and we could not let her stay out in the cold storm shed. It is times like this that test people, and we were getting to know George and Maggie. We had not asked nor wanted them to stay with us, but they were out of money and had no other place to go. So they just stayed on. George promised to pay his share of the living expenses after work opened up in the spring, and I'll say in passing that he paid a scanty part of the next fall through our own milk and potatoes and hay were not counted. We could not keep the whole house warm, so we shut off the front room and kept the fire going in the kitchen stove, using it for both cooking and warmth. Mary in her rocking chair on the side close up to the oven door, and Maggie with her baby in her rocking chair in the other warm place on the other side of the stove, with the heat from the open door on her feet and knees and the baby in her lap. George would crowd next to Maggie, getting part of the warmth from the oven, while the rest of us did the best we could. Grace sat most of the time in Mary's lap, while Ma and Carrie and I hovered in front or crowded in the back of the stand between the stove and the wall, always giving Pa room when he came in from chores, for Pa did all the chores, while George sat by the fire. Pa would get up in the bitter cold and start the fire singing, "Oh, I am as happy as a big sunflower that nods and bends in the breezes," while George lay snug and warm in bed until breakfast was nearly ready. George was always first at the table and at any meal, and and fair though the rest of us ate sparingly and fairly because food was scarce, he would gobble, not denying himself even for Maggie, as we did because of her nursing the baby. As our potatoes became scarce, he would help himself first to them and hurry and eat them so quickly that he always burned himself on them. Then clapping his hand to his mouth, he would exclaim, "Potatoes do hold the heat." This happened so often, the rest of us made a byword of it. George was nearly always underfoot in his place at the stove, but Pa was quite a favorite among the other men, and used to spend some time where they gathered with the Wilder boys who were batching a little way down the street or at Fuller Brothers hardware store across the street from us. At those places there were no women or children to be first, and they each had an equal chance at the fire. They told stories and sang songs and played games. They didn't eat and drink, but at least they were merry for tomorrow. They might die in a blizzard. Henry Hintz and his saloon were still there, and his supplies of drink were lasting, the only supplies in town that lasted through the winter. A man might have taken a drink occasionally, but we never saw or heard of anyone drinking, and no one got drunk through all the hardships. A man might have taken oh, wait a minute. When the thermometer stands at from 25 to 40 below zero and a blizzard wind blows most of the time, it takes a good deal of twisted hay to keep an unfurnished finished house warm enough to live in. Everyone had been burning hay except the banker, who would not condescend to such. He had bought lumber at the lumber yard for $28, 1,000 feet until he had burned it all. Now he must burn hay or freeze, and the hay that had been stacked in town all had been burned. Hay must be bought in from the country, or everyone would freeze. A blizzard lasted 3 days, and there would be clear, still day. Then the next blizzard would strike. There might be a few hours less than 3 full days' storm, and again there might be less than a whole clear day. 2 days between storms was a remarkable event. It gave the impression of a malignant power of destruction, wreaking havoc as long as possible, then pausing for breath to go on with the work. Or as Pa forcibly put it, the blizzard just let us go spit in our hands. Then an old woodsman saying, "Do you get it?" During the storm, people stayed close. On this still day, they hurried here and there to do what they must be done before the next storm. So on these clear days, hay must be hauled in by whom and how. Some of the men were afraid to go out of town, or at all. They might be caught in the storm. They came too suddenly sometimes. Some could not stand the cold. Besides, it was very difficult to get to the haystacks, which were in beyond the big slough. The snowdrifts on the uplands were hard enough to drive a team over, making only slight marks on the snow with their hoofs. But it was different in the slough. There in the places the tall grasses were twisted and lodged by the wind, leaving a cavity underneath. The snow had blown in over them, forming a crust above, while the warmth from the ground and the shelter of the grass kept the snow soft underneath. A horse was heavy enough to break through the crust into these holes, and the sled would be pulled in on the top of him. And there was one mess. If a team fell through, they were likely to injure each other, floundering around, for naturally they were terrified to suddenly fall into a pit and sink into the snow above their backs. Our hay was at the farm, and the big slough must be crossed to get it. One of our horses was very wise and gentle, with a great confidence in Pa. Him, Pa hitched to the sled alone with the traces made longer so when he fell through the snow crust, the sled would not be pulled in after him. Then with his hay fork, the snow shovel on the sled, he and Charlie, the horse, would go after a load of hay, and working together, they would bring it safely home. When Charlie broke through the crust into the pit of a soft snow, he would be quiet while Pa shoveled the snow from in front of him, cut steps in the hard snow bank, and taking him by the bridle, helped him out. The sled, meantime, at the end of the long traces, stood still on the hard bank. When Charlie was out, he drew the sled around the hole, and they went on until the snow-cut crust broke again, and the process was repeated. Arrived at the stack, snow must be shoveled again before the hay could be got. It took all of the short winter day to make the trip. The hay would last for the stock and the fire through the blizzard. that always came at once on the next day. The trip must be made again in the same way, for the blizzard had obliterated all signs, and there was no way of knowing where the hole was, the snow, until Charlie fell through. The Wilder boys hauled hay in the same way for the most of the other people in town. There was no more fires kept than were necessary. School had been closed soon after our experience coming home through the storm. It was not safe to be so far out so it was not safe to be so far out even when we could get there and the fuel was needed in the homes. When the last flour in town disappeared in the grand final at $1 a pound, was Ma discouraged? She was not. Pa brought in his seed wheat and we ground it in the hand coffee mill. With this whole wheat flour, she made mush or biscuits raised with soda and souring made by putting a little of the flour into warm water and setting it under the stove to keep warm and sour. It made a usable substitute for sour milk. Baking powder was not used then. The best cake makers used soda and cream of tartar in proper combination to raise their cakes. But we were not making cakes that winter. Everyone was grinding the seed wheat in town the same way and using it for bread. It was slow work grinding enough wheat to make flour, make bread to feed 8 people, and whoever was not twisting hay for fuel must be grinding wheat for bread. Mary helped with this a good deal, for she could not sit in her warm place by the fire, hold the mill between her knees, and grind. But George and Maggie took no part in the labor. As our supply of wheat became low, Pa used to go down to the Wilder boys' place and get some of theirs. Wishing to save their seed if possible, they had boarded up their wheat bin, which was in one end of the room in which they lived, so that it looked like the end of the room and no one knew the wheat was there. They bored a hole through the boards into the wheat, which they plugged with a piece of wood. When we had to have more wheat, Pa would pull the plug, let the wheat run out into his bucket, then put the plug back. But soon the other supplies of wheat in town were used up, and even if the Wilder boys had let their seed be used, it would not have been enough. Something more had to be done. Living 12 miles southwest or southeast was a farmer who had raised some wheat the year before, and if we were all to live until spring, someone must go after it. A merchant named Loftus said he would finish the money to buy it and sell it out to the people as they needed it. It was dangerous to go after it, and no one wanted to go. But finally, the youngest Wilder boy and Cap Garland, each with one horse on a sled, used to haul hay from the slough, started. I think no one really expected them to get back, for 12 miles is a good part of it through sloughs, where the horses would break through and have to be dug out, looked almost hopeless of being done and in one day and must be done between storms. It was clear, still cold day, and helping the horses through drifts, and did they make Pa did they made the trip safely, getting back some time after dark. The blizzard struck again before morning. The boys had charged nothing for making the trip, at the peril of their lives, but had cheerfully gone for the sake of the community. They had paid the farmer $1.50 a bushel for the wheat, which he had not wanted to sell as it was his seed. Now, when Loftus sold it to the people, he charged them $2.50 a bushel. He had sold only a little at this price when it became generally known. Then the men in town gathered together and went to Loftus' store in a body. After they had talked to him, he paid back the overcharge to the men who brought the wheat at 2.50, and he sold the rest at $1.50 a bushel. There was a yoke of cattle in town belonging to a man named French, a bachelor who had moved in from his farm for the winter. There were his work team, but he was persuaded to butcher them and sell out the meat. So we had a little beef to go with our whole wheat bread. There was in-town lawyer named Walters who expected to go east early in the winter to be married, but had got caught by the storm. Now the wedding day was drawing near and no way to get transportation out. He decided to walk. In the middle of January, he started before daylight one morning as the blizzard wind was dying down and the sky was cleared. It was a scant day's calm this time, and we were afraid he was caught in the next storm. But he walked the miles to Brookings safely after resting, walked on to Tracy. The next spring, we learned that he arrived safely in time for his wedding, but both feet were so badly frozen that he was unable to walk on that day. However, his feet recovered and he came back in the spring, bringing his wife with him. January went by and February with my 15th birthday. March was stormy still, and we began to wonder if spring would ever come. It seemed as though we had been grinding wheat and twisting hay for years. We were getting shorter tempered. Pa did sing in the morning about the happy sunflower, and I had even told George if he was not warm enough to suit him, he could go twist some hay, for I was tired, and in spite of Ma's frown, offered to hold the baby while Maggie washed the dishes. One day a herd of antelope was sighted near town. All the men went hunting. The antelope were wandering in search of food, looking for places where the wind had barred the ground and they could reach the buffalo grass. They were in the little valley-like depression in the surrounding prairie, and the men went on horseback, hoping to surround them. All the men were on all the men were on horseback. Those without horses had borrowed. It was agreed that each should ride so that they would reach the herd from all sides at about the same time. French had borrowed a horse from the youngest Wilder boy. It was the fastest horse in town, but afraid of the sound of the gun, and French had been warned to be sure to hold her fast when she shot off his gun. But when he saw the antelope, he was so excited he forgot everything. Without paying any attention to the others, he ran his horse closer. Then, while still out of rage, he jumped off, let go of the reins, and shot. He didn't hit any antelope, being too far away, but he scared the horse. So she ran away, and among them, the antelope bunched close around her, and away they all went across the prairie. The other men dared not shoot for fear of hitting the horse, so the antelope, all but one, got clear away. Pa shot one, and it was divided among the crowd, making only a taste apiece. My sympathy had been with the antelope. They had been having a hard winter too, and I could have cried when I saw the poor little starved one they had brought home. Although our wheat was getting low again, and the beef was only a pleasant memory, the horse ran with the antelope herd for 2 hours before she became quiet enough to let the antelope go on without her, and her master on her mate came up to get her. With the 1st of April, the weather turned warmer, and there were no more had storms. Bare prairies showed in spots, and farmers went back to their claim shanties and began their spring work. Men were at work on the railroad too, and soon the trains would be running again. But it was the 9th of May before the first train could get through. We knew it was coming, and when it whistled, all the men ran to the depot to welcome it. Our mouths watered at the thought of good food, for were on short rations of even our wheat bread. The trains came rolling in while everyone cheered. Then it was found that it was a whole train of farm machinery, sulky plows, seeders, harvester, mowing machines, rakes, even threshing machines that couldn't possibly be used before fall. All the tools necessary to raise us something to eat for the next winter. In the meantime, the mob of men came near wrecking the train and would have done so if they had not found on the very end an immigrant car. Mr. Woodworth broke open the door and divided the food among the people according to the number of persons in the family, for it had come to rationing. In the car were provisions of all kinds, enough to last the emigrant's family for some time, besides seed, wheat, and potatoes. Everyone went home carrying its share: a little sugar, some flour, a bit of salt, pork, some dried fruit, a little tea. What rejoicing there was when Pa came. I think none of us had realized the strain we had been under until it broke. Pa got some sacks, and it went back for his share of the wheat and potatoes. The train could not go on until the next day, for the track through the cut west of town was not clear before then. The train came the next day, but it was a trainload of telegraph poles. Unreasonable as it was, I think no one who was there at the time could ever feel kindly toward a railroad company. Finally, food came in, and at last our Christmas barrel with the turkey still solidly frozen. The prairie turned a beautiful green, and at last the hard winter of 1880 to 81 was over.